given our early experiences, we create a view of the world and of ourselves and of other people that then governs how we are in the world and how we feel about everything. When I talk about stress, I talk about a threat that the organism doesn't know how to respond to. And the biggest triggers for stress, according to the research, are loss of control, uncertainty, lack of information, and conflict. So when you subject people to those circumstances, which in this society happens a lot, people are stressed, often beyond their capacity to deal with it. Now that capacity is very much programmed by what happened to us very early in life. There's many healing paths, but my own approach can be summed up in 2 words: compassionate inquiry. So if you can be curious, the inquiry part is the curiosity part. I reacted that way. Oh, why did I react that way? Not why did I react that way? That's not compassionate. I reacted that way. I felt his pain. I felt overwhelmed. I felt hatred. I felt rage. I felt despair. What is that about? So you have to have that curiosity, and you have to have the compassion to look at yourself not through that voice that tells you that you're worthless, but to say, if I reacted that way, there must be a good reason for it. Something in me, there's something happened to me that made me react that way at some point. So rather than putting oneself down or thinking that if I have problems, it means I'm deficient, have the curiosity to look into it and the compassion to not to judge yourself for it. And that both can be learned. Both the curiosity and the compassion can be learned. What is crucial is to make the distinction that what I'm experiencing now is a resonance of the past. And I don't have to keep having that same resonance if I can reinterpret the meaning that I gave to that past experience. It's not so much that people don't remember what happened, it's that they don't associate it with suffering, because already when they were experiencing it, they had to repress their emotions. From my point of view, very often, the people that do develop chronic illness are people that have suppressed their own true selves for the sake of being accepted to others. And that self-suppression has deep physiological consequences on the immune system, on the nervous system, on the heart, and so on. So that self-suppression is also physiological self-annihilation in some ways. What these people call courage, of being myself, is actually a trauma imprint that for some reason they learned early in life, that to be themselves is to court rejection by their environment. So it's not a lack of courage. You can't talk about a 1-year-old lacking courage or a 2-year-old. It's simply an adaptation. Now later on they say courage, but really that courage or the lack of it is a shorthand for something happened to me that I gave up my true self for the sake of being accepted. Yeah. And that cost me. First of all, it cost them in terms of physical illness, but also cost them in terms of self-respect and dignity. If in early childhood you're given the sense that you're valued, just because you existed, your parents welcome you and validate you and value you and celebrate you just because you are, then you don't have to keep proving it afterwards. Mm-hmm. But if you don't get that sense, then you have to be important.
Yeah.
So that sense of needing to be important has to come from missing out on being valued for who you are, or being only valued for your achievements. Impressive, first of all, has to do with what? It has to do with our impact on other people, how others see us. So if I can just be myself and express my own truth and not drive myself into activities that are not good for me and people are impressed, well, that's great. But if my intention is to impress other people, if I need for me to make a certain impression in somebody else's mind, then where am I living? but I'm living in their minds rather than in myself. So the question is, where do I want to live? Here or in your mind? You know, and our society is so addicted to people being impressive in the minds of others. That means that we live in the minds of others more than we live in ourselves. So if you can be yourself, and if I find that impressive, that's great. But you're not doing it to impress me. No. You're just doing it because you're expressing who you are. If I'm impressed, great. If I'm not impressed, that doesn't take anything away from you. But to the degree that we're dependent on impressing others, we're robbing ourselves. Suppression of emotion. Nobody's born with it. And it's not a lack of courage or wisdom. It's a programmed response to childhood experience. So people have got the message before they had any choice in the matter, that if they are truly themselves, if they express who they are, their emotions, just like we've been talking about, they won't be accepted. So that's a programming that people are ingrained in their early childhood. How is that their fault? Yeah. It's just the way they adapted to the environment necessarily. As a matter of fact, it was an inevitable and unavoidable adaptation, because the alternative of being rejected by their families or their milieu was not acceptable to a small child. So therefore, nobody does this to themselves in any conscious or deliberate sense. What I can tell you is that when people are diagnosed and they become aware of these dynamics, they find that liberating. There's a lot of information now, a lot of scientific information that shows the connection between, actually, in fact, the unity of mind and body, and the inextricable relationship between the immune system and emotions and so on. It's a very simple question. Where in your life are you not saying no? Where there's a no that wants to be said, but you're not saying it for the sake of pleasing others? Can you just consider that one? Because that simple issue of not saying no can play havoc with your health. Because if you're not saying no, when you're wanting to say no, you're actually suppressing yourself. And then you're taking on more stress and more burden. As I quote in The Myth of Normal, my friend Bessel van der Kolk, the trauma psychiatrist, looked at me once, this is about 10, 12 years ago, we were having lunch, and he said, "Gabor, you don't have to drag Auschwitz around everywhere you go." And what he meant by that is that you don't have to let that affect your present moment. That you can be aware of it, hold a memory of it, but not let it determine your internal states. You know, and it's true. And I understood intellectually at that time what he meant, but it was only later that I was actually able to emotionally let go. I think chronic regret is debilitating. It's a lack of self-forgiveness. It's also kind of egotism of that somehow I'm that important. It's quite something to recognize. I do recognize that some of the way I parented my kids, the way I showed up, wasn't the best for them, but it was the best I could do at the time. So it's not the question of justifying anything, but it's also not dwelling on the past. Regret is to dwell on the past. And what's the point? It's quite something to recognize that I did things that, had I known differently, I would not have done the same way. That's just learning. Regret is an emotional state of that values the past more than the present. Curiosity. So, not why am I living this way, but why am I living this way? You know, what happened to me? What am I carrying here? So, the key phrase is precisely the one that you introduced, the necessity to be curious. In a compassionate way. So you don't do an interrogation of yourself like you're a prosecuting detective of why did you or why did you not, but compassionately, why did you not? Why did you? And if you ask these questions compassionately and with curiosity, the answers will emerge, as will the capacity for you to make different choices as you move forward. Trauma then it comes from the Greek word for wounding. Trauma is a wound.
It's a psychic wound that leaves a scar, it leaves an imprint in your nervous system, in your body, in your psyche, and then shows up in multiple ways that are not helpful to you later on. So trauma then is not what happened to you. So trauma is not the difficult incidents, like trauma is not the war, trauma is not the abuse that people experience, trauma is not the pain that they felt. Trauma is the wound that they sustained as a result. So the trauma wasn't, for example, the sexual abuse. Trauma was the wound that the person sustained as a result of having been abused. That's the good news, because if trauma is the wound that we sustained, it can be healed at any time. What trauma does is it disconnects us. It splits us off from our true self and disconnects us from our emotions, even from our bodies. So that if that disconnection is the essence of trauma, then the healing is that coming together of the self to become whole again. The unhealed wounds, you may think you've gone past them, but then something will happen that touches that wound and you react like you're being tormented all over again for the first time.
In this society, and I'm not blaming parents, in this society, it's extraordinarily difficult for parents to give those conditions of what the American psychotherapist Carl Rogers called unconditional positive regard, a regard that has no conditions of worth attached to it. I accept you just for who you are, the way you are. That's very difficult for parents to deliver, even with the best of goodwill, because they never had it themselves. Not only that, then there's so much stress. Look at the heart of what is the most important developmental period. For sure, it's the first 3 years, from conception till the end of the first 3 years. Not that it's over then, but that's the template. That's the template. And if our society just understood that, just give the kids 3 good years and do everything you can, do everything you can as a society, as a community, to support parents giving those kids those first 3 years, whatever that takes. We would save so much disease, so much dysfunction, so much crime, so much addiction, so much political conflict for that matter.
So children need unconditional loving acceptance by multiple adult caregivers. Children have a need not to have to work to make the relationship with the parents work. So children need rest from having to struggle to make the relationship functional. So they don't have to be pretty or cute or compliant or clever or successful or any of that stuff. They just need to be, and they don't have to work at getting the parents to accept them. That's an essential need of the child. When I say essential, I mean if it's not met, that'll distort child development. The third need is really crucial, and in our society, it's hardly ever met, which is the child needs the freedom to experience all the emotions that nature has endowed her or him with. So we have certain brain circuits for anger, for love, for play, for lust, for seeking, curiosity. All these circuits are there for a reason. We share them with other animals. We share them with bear cubs and puppies, and in our society, parents are often advised and taught to suppress certain emotional experiences on the part of the child. The fourth essential need is free play out in nature. Free play, spontaneous, creative, imaginative play. But that's essential for healthy brain development. We share that with other animals. Baby elephants play, bear cubs play, puppies play, lion cubs play. Crucial for brain development. We know that now. In our society, we put cognitive development way ahead of play, and we deprive our children of play by giving them gadgets, which deprives them of imagination. So we're actually undermining their brain development and their healthy unfolding as human beings. So children can be wounded, not just by bad things happening to them, but by their needs not being met. And in our society, when you ask about the environmental conditions that undermine health and child development, these environmental conditions in our society are inimical to healthy human unfoldment. No wonder we have so many children in trouble. It's not possible to love kids too much. In fact, there's a very interesting study where they looked at a large number of mothers and their infants in the early few months. And most mothers in this study were seen as really good mothers, and some were a bit distant and because of their own traumas, not as available. And a small group were seen as like super loving in how they doted over their infants, okay? 30 years later, they looked at these infants now as adults. The ones that were most emotionally grounded and healthy were the ones who had received the super loving. So there's a difference between, you can't love a child too much. It occurs to me that loneliness is always perception. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Loneliness has got an emotional charge to it, and that's very much a matter of perception. You can be alone and not be lonely, and you can be surrounded by all kinds of people and be completely lonely. So that depends, how open am I? How vulnerable am I really willing to be? What defenses have I erected around myself to protect myself that keeps me from really contacting other people? So I think we unwittingly generate loneliness